David sat on the worn-out couch in his small apartment, staring at a pile of unpaid bills. The flickering light above him seemed to echo the uncertainty in his mind. His wife, Sarah, stood beside him, her face filled with concern. Their daughter, Emily, played in the corner, humming a tune to herself, completely unaware of the stress and anxiety her parents were facing. Sarah glanced at David, her voice gentle. "The landlord came by again today," she said softly. "He said if we don't pay the rent by the end of the week, we'll have to leave." David let out a deep sigh and rubbed his temples. "Where are we supposed to go, Sarah? We can't afford anything else. I can't lose this place." His eyes fell to the bills scattered across the coffee table. The amounts seemed to mock him, their demands endless. It had been months since he'd felt financially secure, and now, it seemed like everything was crashing down all at once. Sarah sat down beside him, resting her hand on his arm. "David, I know this isn't easy, but maybe we could ask your boss for a small advance? If he could give you even a little, we might be able to make it through this week." David shook his head, his face clouded with doubt. "I already asked Mr. Thompson last month. He barely gave me enough to cover one of the bills. I don't think he's going to agree again. The shop is barely doing well, and every day, it's the same customers, buying just enough to get by. I can't keep asking him for more. I just can't." Sarah squeezed his hand, a sad smile forming on her lips. "We've made it through tough times before, David. We'll get through this, too. We always do." But David wasn't so sure anymore. Their life had always been about making do with what they had, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. The rent, the bills, the car repairs, Emily's school fees, it was all too much. And no matter how hard he worked, it never felt like enough. The next morning, David went to work at the hardware store where he had been employed for the last 5 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, barely. Mr. Thompson, his boss, was a gruff man with little patience for nonsense, but he was fair. He appreciated David's work ethic and the honesty he brought to every task. But honesty didn't pay bills, and lately, David was starting to wonder if being a good, honest man was enough to keep his family afloat. As he arrived at the store, the familiar smell of wood, paint, and metal greeted him. The store was busy, as usual, with customers coming and going, buying everything from screws to power tools. But David's mind was elsewhere. He was consumed by the thought of the unpaid rent, the looming threat of eviction, and the uncertainty of what would happen if he couldn't find a solution soon. The day passed slowly. David moved boxes, swept the floor, helped customers, and did everything he could to keep the store running smoothly. But as the hours ticked by, his mind kept drifting to one thought: how could he solve this? It was late in the afternoon when David found himself alone in the store. Mr. Thompson had gone out for a meeting, leaving David in charge. As he was organizing the shelves, he noticed something on the counter, a small stack of cash, the day's earnings. It wasn't unusual for Mr. Thompson to leave the money out while he went to the back to check inventory, but today, something felt different. The temptation was overwhelming. David stood frozen, staring at the cash. His heart pounded in his chest, and a knot tightened in his stomach. Just a little bit, he thought. If I take just a small portion, no one will notice. I can pay the rent, buy some food, and then everything will be okay. Just this once. His hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing the money. He could already picture how easy it would be to slip a few bills into his pocket. It was just a temporary solution, wasn't it? It wasn't like he was stealing. He'd pay it back, eventually. He always had good intentions. But as his hand hovered over the cash, another thought struck him. one that made him stop in his tracks. What would this cost me? He asked himself. David stepped back, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his honesty. It was something he valued deeply. Ever since he was young, his parents had taught him to live with integrity, to be someone people could trust. And now, in his most desperate moment, he was about to betray everything he stood for. Would it be worth it? Could he live with the consequences of that one choice? For what felt like an eternity, David stood there, torn. The weight of the decision was crushing him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing himself to walk away from the money. He couldn't do it. He couldn't betray the trust that had defined his life. That evening, David returned home, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his choice. He didn't have the money to pay the rent, and he didn't know what he was going to do. But as he walked through the door, Sarah looked at him with a small, reassuring smile. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice hopeful. David didn't know how to answer her. He didn't want to burden her with his worries, but he knew he had to tell her the truth. "I didn't take the money, Sarah. I couldn't. I couldn't live with the lie." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but it wasn't because of the struggle they were facing. It was because she understood. She understood that David's integrity was more important than anything else. She knew the weight he had carried all day, the internal battle between what was right and what was easy. "I'm proud of you, David," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it's hard, but we'll figure it out. We always do." The next morning, David woke up with a heavy heart, unsure of what the day would bring. He knew he had to find a way to pay the rent. As he was about to leave for work, he received an unexpected call from Mr. Thompson. "David," Mr. Thompson said on the other end of the line, "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. I know things have been tough for you, and I respect your honesty. I can't offer you a raise right now, but I can give you a small loan to help cover your rent. We'll work out the details later." David stood in shock, his mind racing. He had never expected this. He had always respected Mr. Thompson, but he had never imagined that his boss would offer him a loan out of the blue. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," David said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Thompson replied. "I can see you're doing your best. I respect that." David hung up the phone, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to pay the rent, enough to buy some groceries, enough to keep his family in their home. When David returned home that evening, he shared the news with Sarah. The relief on her face was immediate, and Emily ran up to hug him, not understanding the full extent of the struggle, but sensing that everything was going to be okay. As they sat together that night, David realized something profound. The temptation to take the easy way out had been strong, but he had chosen to remain honest. In the end, his integrity had not only saved his job but also helped him find a solution. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: honesty wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about living in a way that needed no lies. And that, David thought as he hugged his family close, was the greatest gift he could ever give them.